everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Alison Burke and I work here at the OECD's Directorate for Education and Skills. Today we are going to discuss how we can assess creative thinking. What is creative thinking? Why is it important to assess it? And how can we assess it? To help us think about these questions and more, I'm very pleased to be joined by Bill Lucas, Professor of Learning and Director and Co-founder of the Centre for Real World Learning at the University of Winchester, Bo-Stjern Thompson, the Chair of Learning Through Play at the LEGO Foundation, Natalia Gonzalez Gomez, the Director of Evaluation and Assessment at ICFES, which is the Colombian Institution for Educational Assessment, Mario Piancenetti, Senior Analyst at OECD Directorate for Education and Skills, and Natalie Foster, Analyst at the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills, both of whom work in our PISA Innovation Research and Development team. Thank you all for joining us. Before we begin our discussion with our panelists, I'd like to invite those of you that are watching on Facebook to ask any questions you have in the comment section, and those here on Zoom to send through your questions in the chat. If you are on Zoom and you would like your questions and comments to be seen by everyone here, you'll just need to choose that option above, which I think we're all getting used to. We'll try to get to as many of the questions that we can throughout this session, but we really encourage you to share as your question may prompt thoughts in others. A recording of this webinar, as well as presentations that are shared, will be available on our webinar page after we finish up, and we'll put the links that you need in the chat and comments for you. So that's it from me. So I shall hand over to Natalie to present PISA 2022 Creative Thinking Framework. Thanks, Natalie. Natalie.
Thanks, Alison. Yeah. First is unmuting, and can you just confirm you can see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it. You just need to go to full screen.
Now?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. I'm going to kick off this webinar just by quickly talking about the PISA approach to assessing creative thinking. In the interest of time, I'm going to do a very brief tour of the main features of our assessment, but there is obviously a lot more that could be said. So for anyone interested after the webinar, I will direct you to our recently published Thinking Outside the Box framework, where you can find more information about the process for developing the assessment. And I think one of my colleagues will put that in the chat. But I will dive straight into some of the main features. So how do we define creative thinking in PISA? The creative thinking, for us, how we define it is the competence to engage productively in the generation, evaluation, and improvement of ideas that can result in original and effective solutions, advances in knowledge, and impactful expressions of imagination. So we've decided to define creative thinking in this way for several reasons. As some of you may know, the broader literature on creativity, there are several definitions of creativity that exist, but we decided to focus on the narrower aspects of creative thinking in PISA. Firstly, because we wanted to focus on the kind of cognitive processes of idea generation rather than some of the broader aspects related to creativity, such as socio-cultural value judgments on how useful or novel a product is. That's quite challenging to do in the context of an international comparative assessment. So we thought focusing on the general process of idea generation was much more manageable. Secondly, was due to time constraints in the PISA assessment. You know, normally students are given 2 to 5 minutes to answer a series for each task. And it's quite difficult to engage in an entire process of generating a product that has these kind of novel and useful aspects to it, whereas in 2 to 5 minutes, it's relatively much more easy to engage in the process of coming up with an idea, of evaluating an idea. And thirdly, we wanted our definition to reflect everyday notion of creativity. So in the literature, there are some distinction between kind of big C creativity, little c or everyday creativity. And we felt that creative thinking and this definition particularly reflected that everyday notion that each one of us, everyone on this webinar, is capable of engaging in the process of coming up with ideas and evaluating ideas. So there's the main reasons why we developed our definition of creativity in this way. So how exactly do we actually operationalize this definition for assessment? We break our definition down into 3 facets or kind of skill sets, if you like. The first is generate diverse ideas. And within this skill, this encompasses the idea of ideational fluency and ideational flexibility, which is summarized under the banner of divergent thinking within the field of creativity. And that really means, can people come up with multiple ideas, and can they come up with ideas that are actually different qualitatively from one another? Our second facet we call generate creative ideas, and this facet kind of taps into that notion of coming up with a new idea. However, as I said, it's quite difficult to implement or operationalize that in the context of an international comparative survey. So we've taken this idea and we're using the notion of statistical infrequency as a proxy for originality. So what that means is that we have a threshold for where we define an idea is original or not, and that's based on the infrequency of that kind of response with respect to the rest of the student population. And then our third and final facet in the assessment is evaluate and improve ideas, and this reflects notions of convergent thinking that are found in the literature. So can students identify weaknesses in ideas, and can they improve them so that they reach a better outcome or a better solution? Each of these three factors the reason why we've included different domains in the creative thinking assessment is in recognition of the fact that creative thinking to some extent is domain specific. What that means is not that students have to be experts or particularly skilled in any of these four domains in order to engage with the tasks in those domains. It just means that we recognize that performance across or in different domains might be influenced by factors that are not necessarily how well they can generate ideas. You know, in written expression, it might be influenced by how well a student can write, or in visual expression, how well they can use the visual tool that we give them. So by assessing students in different domains, we can both get a sense of strengths and weaknesses, and also get an overall sense of a general creative thinking ability. So I realize this is all a little bit abstract, so I want to show some illustrative examples for what that actually means. You know, how do we actually test students in these skills? So on the screen, you can see an example of a written expression task. I want to emphasize this is not a genuine task from the assessment, it's just an illustrative example, but it shows generally how students are assessed. So we'll give students a short set of instructions for each task, you can see on the left, followed by an open response space. This means that they can, students can answer however they want to any of the tasks. It's completely open-ended. There's no multiple choice in the PISA assessment. And they're also given some kind of stimulus material for each task. So in this written expression task, they're given a series of images, and they have to base, we asked them in the task to come up with, for an example, a story idea, and they have to use these images on the dice shown as inspiration for that story idea. So this is just an example of a kind of task that might exist in the written expression domain for creative thinking, for a generate creative ideas task. So how do we score these kind of tasks? This is probably the single most asked question about the PISA assessment. As I mentioned, students have an open response to all of the tasks in the assessment, and this means that there's an infinite number of responses that we could receive. So this in consequence meant that all of the tasks in the assessment are fully scored by humans. So there are tasks of human scorers in each country who will look at all of the responses and score them according to the criteria that we determine. So how do we support human coders to do that? There are two things. The first is that there are well-defined coding procedures for each facet. So for every single task that corresponds to a particular facet, so one of the generate diverse ideas, generate creative ideas, all of the tasks within that facet are scored according to the same general procedure. Second, there are detailed coding rubrics for each task. And what that means is that the coding rubrics contain item-specific criteria that coders can use to determine whether that response is different, or whether that response is original, and they can use that information to make their judgment. And these coding rubrics have been validated through several rounds of country review, and also by using genuine student data from multiple pilots. So again, I realize this is a bit abstract, so I'm going to walk you through how scoring might be done. So as you can see on screen, these are the general coding procedures that raters use. I'm not expecting you to read them, but hopefully you can see that there's generally 2 or 3 steps that the coders have to go through in order to score any of the tasks. Step 1, regardless of the facet, is to determine whether a response is appropriate. And in the PISA assessment, we take quite a broad view of appropriateness in recognition of the fact that creativity or creative responses can often kind of toe the line when it comes to appropriateness. Creative responses might be a little bit out of the box. So by appropriateness, all we mean is that the student has responded to the task and it's generally on topic. They've generally done what we've asked them to do. So let's take another look at an example. So going back to the written expression example I just presented, where the student has to come up with a story idea based on these images. You can see at the bottom, I've put an example of a response. Again, this is not a genuine student response. It's just to illustrate the process. So let's imagine that a response is: a couple falls in love, they buy a house where they can fish in a lake and hunt in the woods every day. They decide they want more adventure, so they travel around the world. Who knows what life will throw at them next? It's a roll of the dice. So for step 1, we have to determine whether this response is appropriate for the task. And I think we can all safely say it's appropriate. They've provided an idea for a story and it's generally on topic. So we move on to step 2 for generate creative ideas tasks. And there are 2 mechanisms for determining originality. The first is whether a response corresponds to an original theme. And as I mentioned, there are detailed coding rubrics for each task. And these detailed coding rubrics will contain a list for every task of what we consider to be common themes or uncommon themes. And these are the ones that are determined by looking at genuine student responses. So for this task, there might be 5 or 6 themes, 3 of which are common, 3 of which are uncommon. And we might see that this particular response corresponds to one of the common themes, so one of those top 3. In fact, this one could correspond to 2. For example, we could say it is a love story, but it's also an adventure story. So in this second step, it doesn't correspond to an original theme. However, there is a third step in the process for generate creative ideas, and that's in recognition of the fact that just because a response might generally be on the topic of a common theme, it could nonetheless be considered original if it's been elaborated in some original way. So generally, that depends on the type of task it is, but in a written expression task, it could be because there's a plot twist or because there's a new character, or there's generally some kind of original detail in the response. And so here, for example, a coder might decide that the fact that they've interpreted the 2 middle images, so what the image actually is a stick with a handkerchief tied around it and an arrow, but this student has interpreted that as a fishing rod with a fish and a bow and an arrow. So because there's this original interpretation of the image, we can say that there is an original elaboration of this answer. So we code it as an original response. So again, this is just to illustrate the process. This is not a genuine task or a response, but hopefully it's made it a little bit more tangible. And I just want to finish off my 10-15 minutes with what we hope to learn from this assessment. So the first thing with any PISA assessments is that they provide a snapshot of comparative performance by students around the world. The second, as I mentioned, because we are assessing students in different domains, we'll also have some insight into performance strengths and weaknesses within countries and also across countries. And finally, we'll be able to look at correlations between performance and other aspects. So both correlation between students' performance in creative thinking and their performance in the core literacies of reading, maths and science, but also look at the correlation between creative thinking, performance scores, and characteristics of education policies and practices around the world. I realize that is a very quick whistle-stop tour of the PISA framework, but I don't want to take up too much time, so I will hand back to Alison, who will introduce the rest of the panelists, and we can hear from them too. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Natalie. We've already got some really great questions coming in about, this practicality on measuring creative thinking. I really appreciate the time you spent to give us an example there. So thank you very much. But yes, we'll continue on and get a few more perspectives from different areas. So I would like to talk to Bill Lucas now. Bill, some might argue that skills like creativity shouldn't or cannot be assessed. So we've all been there. They say this is not accessible, and they can't be assessed particularly like we assess more traditional subjects like maths or science. What do you think in terms of assessment of creative thinking? In your opinion, is assessment important in the context of encouraging the integration and development of skills like creative thinking in formal education?
Thank you, Alison. That's about 5 embedded questions there.
It is, sorry.
So I'm going to just go to the moral high ground for me, which is, do I think that it's valuable and doable to assess creative skills to start with, and argue that I believe it is both valuable and doable. And I'm then going to pull out to, and this will hopefully build on Natalie's presentation, what I think we might be able to learn in systems across the world from the great work that the PISA Creative Thinking 2022 team have been doing. So first of all, I think that the decision by PISA to create this test is a moment in the timeline of the status of creativity in schools, unambiguously. I mean, how many people on this call would ask the question, do we need to assess scientific thinking? It would seem quite preposterous because there would be an instinctive assumption that we do and probably that we can, and PISA empirically demonstrating that indeed we can. So there's a status issue. I think there's a real politic issue as well, whether you're a system leader, a head teacher, a teacher, a parent thinking about which school to send your child, because that is, we all know that what gets measured gets done in schools. We may or may not like that, but it's a fact of educational life. I think from our own research, and some of you may be familiar with our 5-dimensional model of creativity, which the OECD's published as a working paper and is now in use in 35 countries across the world, we discovered that there are some significant improvements when you assess creative thinking. And these would include, but not be limited to, the development of a common language. And I particularly like the way that the PISA test is framing not just a conventional definition, but by quite explicitly locating part of it in science. I think this is really important. I'll come on to say why in a second. So the flow of assessment in schools is that it needs to be integrated with pedagogy and with curriculum. And if we're going to do that, we absolutely have to be able to define what creative thinking is. Now, PISA's taken a bold, I think, decision. I was a little bit part of it, so I'm going to say it anyway, to combine what for some is a mixture of creativity and critical thinking into a holistic whole. I think that's very helpful. It allows us neatly to think of 3 C's, creative thinking, collaboration, and communication as the kind of contemporary antidote to the 3 R's. And it allows us to, or at least me, to riff off that idea. We need, once we've got the definition, and I'll come on to this when we talk about educational jurisdictions, to think about what it looks like everyday creativity, or little c or mini c creativity for a 5-year-old and for a 19-year-old, and everything in between. And that's quite complicated. And I don't think we've done that yet. And I hope that's the next period of work that we might get into in PISA Creative Thinking 2022 follow-up activity. You also need to be able to look at the intersection between creative thinking. Again, the PISA group very elegantly recognizes both the domain general and the domain specific elements of creativity. But we do need to understand, I believe, as states like Alberta have in Canada, how states like Victoria have in Australia, how a number of educational jurisdictions are showing can be done, how it locks into science, into maths, into history, into every subject of the formal curriculum. And we may hear more about this from Bo, from the informal curriculum of play and the co-curriculum of school life. So there's something about it improving understanding, and it improves the quality of learning. It includes the quality of teaching too. And our colleagues at OECD CERI have shown how there are a growing number of well understood signature pedagogies, which, not like night after day, because teaching is complex, are more likely to create the environment in which creative thinking can flourish. Last bit in answer to this question, and I'm not going to go into the technicalities of whether it not can or cannot be assessed.
Oh, sorry, Bill, you've just pressed mute on yourself. If you could unmute.
I've just put into the chat and pressed mute on myself in a remarkable display of incompetence, a field guide to assessing creative thinking, which I hopefully will answer some of those questions for listeners. But the final thing I want to pull together here is that this decision to teach and assess and embed systematically creative thinking, which I believe is what we're talking about here, has a massive implication from the way we think about the point of school. And it allows us to think, yes, about disciplines, but also about inter and transdisciplinarity, which I think in a number of different, many of the Scandinavian countries, Finland, Sweden, Norway, all investigating this, I think is a key part. What can we learn from PISA? What can we not learn? What we will not be doing is hour-long online tests, but we will be flooding the system with formative approaches that I think will draw very heavily on the PISA work.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate that, and appreciate you answering multiple questions at once. But the next question that I have is really looking at good examples, promising examples of creative thinking assessment in particular. So are there any countries that are leading the way in terms of integrating the development of assessment of creative thinking education?
Yes, I think there are. Do tell me if I accidentally, as I move things around, press my mute button.
Totally fine.
But not very many at all. And so I think the most well-developed example is Australia. Australia, like Canada and a number of other large countries, has a national curriculum body, and then education provision is a state educational jurisdiction matter. So in Australia, not only is critical and creative thinking part of one of a number of general capabilities. If you think of a piece of weaving, I think it's sometimes helpful to think of the web and the weft. And the web are the disciplines that we all know, and the weft are these engaging interdisciplinary concepts like critical and creative thinking. And not only does this give legitimacy, but in the national curriculum, it's also spelled out in 2-year chunks what progression might look like. So an absolute basic building block in a system that's serious about this is to have a continuum where you, as a group of teachers, moderating, remember, products and processes. So it's really tricky. It's not quite even like the PISA example. You don't necessarily have all of those artifacts in front of you. You're having to look in real time at what children and young men and women are doing. So Australia, the state of Victoria, which has been routinely online testing 15-year-olds. It's been my privilege to work with them for 7 years now. And these are non-identified, not high stakes, rising and lowering tide metrics of how the population of Victoria's 15-year-olds is doing in this regard. And it can give you feedback if you want it. And also it's very interesting, as with the PISA test, it's authentic, largely scenario-based, capable of being interpreted at different levels. So Australia and Victoria would be absolutely the top of my list. If you wanted to look again in Australia, head west and look at some of the developmental work that's taking place in Western Australia. Curriculum less advanced, but practice in many examples very advanced. If you stand back from what it is that Australia is doing, and please forgive me if you're on this call and thinking, who is this idiot and why have they not mentioned my country? Forgive me, but I've recently looked at this, certainly in what is available in English, and there isn't anything that I found, and I'd love you to prove me wrong by sending me examples of national curriculum that is doing this. So what we can notice, so there is an example of a pan-national model, and that's Michael Fullan's work in New Pedagogies for Deep Learning. And there are really helpful progression continua for the teaching and assessing and embedding of creative thinking. Interesting, if you look at the Brookings Institution work on this, they will remind us that although creativity and creative thinking appears in about 21 countries now, or jurisdictions, It's only in 5 of those that you get some kind of coherent progression document, and it's almost none who are giving reliable evidence-based guidance on how you assess it. And I think that's one of the opportunities of the next stage of work around the PISA test. One of the things that countries that are interested in this seem to me to have in common is that they've developed a competence-based curriculum. Without that, it's very difficult to move, especially at higher or secondary level, beyond the slightly atomized view of secondary education. So another good example would be Canada. I've already mentioned the state of Alberta, which cross-maps creative thinking against each of the school subjects. I could take you to British Columbia, also doing very interesting work, or Ontario. At the country level, I can see bits of this in, and again, forgive me if I'm not about to mention your country, but in Norway, in Portugal, at a much smaller system level in Singapore, in Latvia, in New Zealand, quite a long tradition of interest extracurricular wise in creativity and a competence-based approach, and Brazil. And even most recently, I've been very pleased to be working with Shanghai in China, looking at how we might bring problem-based learning and deeper learning and creative thinking together. If you want a country example, and I can see there's a colleague online here, I'd go to Ireland, the island of Ireland, because I think Ireland has decided almost to brand itself as Creative Ireland. So the higher level is the whole state is about creativity and being creative. And then within education, some really interesting initiatives. It's one of the countries like Wales that is also using our 5-dimensional model. 2 last things. One, I think where states not only have a competence-based curriculum, but are also interested in both disciplinary and interdisciplinary learning, I think that's an indicator that there might be some interest. And the second example I'd like to leave you with really, and this is the work I'm doing with Rethinking Assessment in the UK and with our friends in Australia, New Metrics for Success, and similarly in the States, the Mastery Transcript Consortium, just one of 3 examples I could give you. If we think about the point of school as being developing knowledgeable, capable young people who can flourish and transfer their knowledge and skill in a range of contexts, in other words, to demonstrate their creative thinking, then it's no good simply ending school life with a set of grades or numbers. I think we have to, almost as a birthright, think of a learning LinkedIn for every 19-year-old, a digital profile. And I think this is some foundational work that we can build off the Creative Thinking PISA 2022 test. I think that was about 8 minutes, so I'll pause there. Thank you very much, Alison.
Thanks so much, Bill. I do appreciate, and a lot of people in the chat are saying thank you for sharing those examples. And we also have people in the chat sharing other examples of other countries that they know of and potentially not in English. So that's really great. If you are in the chat and you know, particularly if you have a link to a curriculum that's integrating creative thinking, we'd love to have it. I'm sure Bill would be very interested. All right, we are running out of time, so I'm going to move us on. Bo, I'd like to talk to you right now, and we're really talking about this focus of assessment. So if the focus of assessments change as a result of the PISA creative thinking test, what will be the impact on the way students learn?
Absolutely. Thank you, Alison. Thank you for having me here from the LEGO Foundation. And I just get so excited about listening to Bill and the examples here. So what more to say? Like literally, this is a very important opportunity. And as Bill said, think about what this means for how we think about school. I know it's just first steps, but talking about an outcome of education to be creativity, including the examples that Natalie shared, that's literally the reality we are looking into right now, that education is about generating ideas, evaluating and improving them to solve real problems. And we have so many problems right now. And, you know, if we can equip young people with the mindset and tools to come up with ideas and to address solutions, I think this is where we are heading right now. So in terms of your question, you know, the impact of students and how they learn, I am pretty sure that when we change the expectations of the outcomes of education, it would also change the students' experience in the classroom. We have much more actively engaged students. more than 60% of our students in some countries are actively disengaged. They literally try to get away from education. And I'm thinking about my job, literally if my colleagues, more than 60% are trying to get away from the job. Like literally this is a motivating factor, I hope, for education. It's also supporting a joy of learning new things, just supporting curiosity, because you equip, with outcomes and environment that is about being open for ideas to test and try out new things. And it's something that we see might also be more meaningful for students. Like, I don't come to work because my manager knows the solution to what I'm going to do. Like, I come to work to be able to come up with new ideas to solve problems. And this is what will be more meaningful for the classroom experience. And what that means is, for us in the foundation and for the work we do with our partners, this is actually a more playful environment. It's an environment where you have more choices, more opportunities to test ideas, more opportunity to be actively engaged and shape your environment. So one of the recent studies we just shared here a few weeks ago, and I'll make a link to it, is that we have summarized more than 300 research studies now from more than 40 countries, where play also show up as an enabler of creativity, along with a broader set of skills also. So actually it will be a more playful environment we would expect to be in school, a more enjoyable environment, because creativity is so interweaved with other skills. So I'm very excited about what this means for the students and for the youth empowerment in the classroom.
That's really great. Look, I used to be a high school teacher, and the idea of a playful classroom was always what I was aiming for in science. So moving then from that idea of there might be a change because of this assessment, that we actually get a view on creative thinking, and it changes our kind of viewpoint on it. What do we need to do to support teachers? And there has been a few questions about this. Are we actually going to be teaching creative thinking? What do we need to support teachers to design creative learning activities, as well as monitoring their students' engagement and process in those activities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it also builds a little bit about what Bill was mentioning in terms of some of the bigger system studies, that it's not enough to only change the outcomes and the aims. You have to build and support teachers with tools and progressions and so forth. And I'll start by saying that all this amazing work that you have been doing in OECD and with the partners is a fantastic starting point. Like, a lot of people have been invested, a lot of great experts around the world throughout the many years to build not only the outcomes, but great examples for this. But I think we see at least 3 things that needs to be in place to support teachers. The first one is a general mindset shift, that you don't come into a classroom where the solution is given, but you're coming into a place where you actually have to address real life problems to come up with ideas, which is not necessarily easy for students. But that mindset is important, not only in terms of the teacher, but the expectations from parents and from school leaders. What we see as barriers many places is that if you are still a parent that expect you only to do good in the standardized grades and the traditional assessments, that puts a little bit of pressure on the teachers to try out new approaches. So the mindset, partly from teachers, but probably more from the parents and the surrounding stakeholders and school leadership. The second one is about the professional development. It's not easy to shift from a mindset and education about teaching where you are the sole source of knowledge to a more classroom that's supporting ideas and evaluating ideas. So that literally requires professional development. And what we have developed with our partners is also simple formative tools, like observation tools, where teachers in the classroom can literally observe, are students now passive, just receiving information, or are they in an active state of engagement and interaction? Are they just repeating the same state of only memorizing and doing the same thing over and over again? Or are they moving to a state where they're iterating, they're testing different ideas and solutions? Or are they in a state where they don't relate to the purpose, they don't relate to the topic, but instead they're relating to real life practices and problems? So it requires some very simple observation tools where teachers can literally see, am I doing a difference right now? Am I moving students or all students in the classroom to that place? And the third thing is a general sense of the environment. like if you support creative thinking, you also need a wider range of opportunities and inspirations. You need more materials. You need access to real life experiences, to community, to organizations, to outdoor, because you need that kind of prompts for your problems and your challenges. So what we see is that it will become a shift in pedagogy, a pedagogical shift where students have more choice and more agency. And it already exists. It's not something we completely need to invent. It exists in somewhat what's also mentioned here, like problem-based learning, project-based learning, where students do like real-life practical projects and portfolios, or aspects of experiential learning, where they're out touching and feeling and working with the community, some aspects of inquiry-based and collaborative forms of learning. So it will lead us to think about, what are the ways we can help and support these types of pedagogical approaches. And I'll just finally say, because Bill mentioned around the new opportunities in technology, I think there are very exciting ways that technologies actually can now support that way of not only an assessment piece, but help teachers and students document their portfolios and the projects they're doing to have much richer conversations on the things they do, but also peer-based feedback in the classroom. So it's a very exciting development we are heading into now.
Yeah, look, I really agree. And that idea of assessment linking to shifts in pedagogy, sometimes that data, I think sometimes people hear the word assessment and get a bit scared and think, oh, it's not going to help with creative thinking. But the idea that data can help us shift curriculum, shift pedagogy is really exciting. So thank you both for your point of view. I'm going to quickly go to Natalia, because Natalia, in her role at ICFES, they've recently been embarking on developing a new national evaluation of creative potential, not creative thinking, creative potential in Colombia. And so we'd like to ask you a few questions around that. So why did ICFES decide to do this? What was the inspirational motivation for doing this across Colombia, so at scale? And what key decisions did you make when developing your framework? And maybe within those key decisions, did you face any challenges? I'm aware that's 4 questions, but I would like to hear from your experience if possible.
Definitely. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and probably good evening to many of the participants of today's webinar. Thank you, Allison. Well, I would first like to start by thanking Natalie and Mario for this amazing invitation for ICFES to participate in this event. And of course, all of the meetings we've had during the past year, and to be very patient with us. Well, a significant part of this endeavor, was influenced by our participation in creative thinking, in the creative thinking module in PISA. Of course, ICFES has always believed that creative potential provides a basis for creating change. And individuals with this potential can transform their surroundings by using their knowledge, their skills, and their abilities to their most. This, of course, has social implications for innovative, diverse fields of knowledge and the productive sector. Now, of course, the assessment that we've worked on for the past 2 years is based on proposing an assessment that can provide evidence related to endogenous and exogenous characteristics that may elicit creative thinking in a sample of high school students between the ages of 16 and 18 years old. This is, of course, what we have thought about and what we are working towards for 2024 to happen. It seeks to provide relevant information to all stakeholders. The assessment, well, that's the objective, to provide information to all stakeholders involved in the educational process for the design of public policy and programs and teaching and learning strategies that contribute to strengthen and enhance creative potential. Like I said, all of this, we've been working hand by hand with my colleagues here at ICFES. We've worked with different psychometricians, game programmers, gamers, etc. But before getting to that part, you mentioned or asked what were those key decisions and what were those particular challenges in developing this idea, and of course, heading towards the development of a solid and rigorous framework. Well, creativity is a skill that can be honed and can be linked to learning, people's accumulated experiences, knowledge, and abilities to prepare them for carrying out creative actions. In that sense, creative potential can be assessed by placing the individual in an interactive environment in which they can express and exhibit characteristics that draw forth or elicit creative skills. Key decisions were, well, first, to shift from creative thinking to a more dispositional approach. And that is why our efforts are primarily focused on creative potential and not creative thinking. Second, well, we had to define the characteristics that shape creative potential. And for this, we worked with, like I mentioned previously, psychometricians, gamers, and game programmers to discuss and determine, and in some cases, validate these characteristics. We concluded from those roundtables with these experts that a innovative assessment for creative potential could be developed in a game-based environment. And from here, we had to define, of course, the model of or the assessment components through the development of a story, which implied the creation of a character that flows in a structured path to measure creative potential. This is, of course, an ongoing work. For creative potential skills, we had to define the set of activities that were going to be established using evidence-centered design, a framework. And in a nutshell, I would mention three challenges we have encountered up until now. Well, the first one, to find a parsimonious model that can yield the highest amount of data. Second, to identify and correct the linkage between the evidence-centered design and the game mechanics. And third, to improve definitions and correctly distinguish assessment components to avoid any overlapping. What are the steps that we are taking to move forward with this assessment? Well, currently, we've been elaborating this year technical reports on the definition of the assessment model that we validated and discussed, as I mentioned, with psychometricians and different gaming experts. And here in this the series of documents, we present the major findings and the decision to develop a game-based assessment. Second, we've also been consolidating the mechanics matrix that will allow us to set the base components for developing the instrument beta version or prototype in the form of a game-based assessment. We are currently, my team is currently designing the initial prototype in the form of a board game. And next month, we should be updating the previous versions of the assessment framework, including, of course, all the lessons learned during this year and the past. And then again, I thank Natalie and Mario for being so patient with ICFES and opening spaces to discuss these things that really, well, we've been thinking about a lot in Colombia, and especially. It's not to mention that here at ICFES, we also have a social and emotional assessment that we developed, influenced and inspired, of course, by the social and emotional skills study developed by the OECD too. And next year, well, we start off very excited with some roundtables that we programmed with high school teachers in order to validate not only the assessment framework, but the beta version of the board game. So I think I've been brief enough. I hope I have. So I finished there.
Thank you, Natalia. You have not just brief, but also really comprehensive, which I appreciate, because seeing this work in action in a country and seeing how you dealt with some of the problems throughout was really helpful. So thank you. We have a little bit of time and we've got heaps of questions coming in. So a lot of questions coming in. So that's excellent. I might group some of the questions together so we can hit them all. I do apologize in advance that we won't be able to go to all of them, but I'd like to talk to Mario, who is the senior analyst in the PISA innovation team. Mario, we have a lot of questions sort of saying, well, why would we even want to assess creativity? There is also a sense that if you assess creativity and you give it a right or a wrong, then you are ruining it, and you've misunderstood creativity. So I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about how your team and the OECD has validated the scoring approach that Natalie explained, and how we're trying to take into account students' opportunities to learn creative thinking.
Yes, thanks for all the questions and feedback. It's great to see this level of participation and engagement with this challenge that we have had for several years. So I would say I think we need really to recognize what is the value of this data and what this data can tell and what this data will not be able to tell. So there were lots of questions about the extent we will be able to validate the findings. PISA is not really designed to do experimental research in the sense of like establishing, for example, causal relationship between a given pedagogical practice implemented in schools and what we observe in the students' responses. So in terms of the way we design the task, with the way we conceptualize creative thinking, we have been mostly building on established research, both at the theoretical level and also in terms of the validity evidence that we have considered. So we have not really started from scratch. There's been over a century of research that has inspected the relationship between certain type of items that can be implemented within the constraints of an assessment that is primarily, as Natalie said, the time constraints. And so all these are measures of creative potential and some external measures such as creative achievement of the students in the past and through follow-up surveys, what they are able to do in the future, the type of career they choose for themselves. So there is the type of items and tasks that we are using are similar to those that have been used in the past, in the research on divergent thinking, on the research on creative potential, Stenberg and others. There is also a lot in the literature that speaks about the evidence for domain-specific abilities in the creative thinking space, and this is also why we have worked and situated the task in relatively different domains. So there are opportunities to validate, to have some validity evidence from the test itself, because something we haven't spoken about is the fact that in addition to the test, there is a questionnaire. There are lots of questions that we're asking to the students on their experiences of learning at school and on their perception of the way they are taught. For example, if they follow like a more linear type of instruction, or they are rather invited to engage in project-based learning, or even if they are in, like, what are the attitudes of the teachers towards them making mistakes? So whether they feel free to express themselves in the classroom. And we will, in the analysis, we will correlate this information with the results of the students. But again, this will be only correlation and evidence. It doesn't replace experimental study that can be undertaken. We hope that we will be able to do follow-up studies, like from the students who have taken the PISA test, but we especially hope that we will make available thousands of responses. That is one of the value of the work we do, the fact that all the data will be available for further analysis. You don't like the way we have defined the scoring, you can get the responses from your countries, from more countries, and score it in different ways. All the data will be available, and we hope that there will be a lot of research on many aspects, even on things that are a bit more controversial, such as cultural differences in the way somebody can be creative or not. There were some questions also about like the reliability of the scoring. and we have done a lot. We have lots of evidence from the pilots, but also we have done a very large pilot, that is the PISA field trial, last year, that served two purposes. One is that we validated that this test works in many different countries. All the questions were scored by two different raters independently. We could check that the raters provided in most cases like consistent responses, but we will also be able to collect sample of responses from students in many different countries and to update the scoring guide. So again, will be a lot in the data that goes beyond what we can reasonably do in our small team in Paris, but hopefully we have already seen from all the pilots the richness of the responses to this task. I think already this is like, I mean, it's not, might be not a very scientific, but I can tell that there is an enormous variety in the way the students approach the task. There are lots of students that simply don't engage with the task at all. There is already an indication that some students have trouble with this more open type of responses. But again, there is sometimes we are really surprised by what the students can do in 5 minutes in this relatively constrained test.
Yeah, super interesting. And I think something I'd like to follow up on, that idea that the data is available for other research, and also just in terms of putting this down helps us to sort of say, well, what, maybe that wasn't good, or maybe that was good, and the idea of piloting the scoring system is really good. I would encourage everybody that's on this chat or involved in these discussions to read the Creative Thinking Assessment Framework, and you can kind of see how open the tasks are. They aren't just a multiple choice question, but they really are trying to allow students to express their creative thinking. So I would encourage you, the link is in the chat and in the comments. Now we've got a little bit of time, and I want to go to some more questions. There was a really interesting question from Ka Lung Chu, who said, how do you differentiate creative interpretation and then misinterpretation? So that I think in, I might ask Bo if you wanted to talk to that. So what's the difference in creative interpretation or creative thinking, and then somebody just misunderstanding the task and sort of going a bit off task?
I think that's a very technical question that Bill might also be able to help on, but I think it's important to note that the definitions in this creativity task is relying on the combination of creativity and critical thinking based on some very practical, authentic problems. So in that case, it's not like a traditional divergent thinking creativity task, but it also means that it's appropriate for education, where you have kind of a need to address learning outcomes and other things. But the particular key thing about interpretation, maybe Bill has some clues for that too.
Bill?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Bo. Just to build on what you've said there, I think so much of our exam systems are predicated on a one right answer model, and so much of life is predicated on a number of authentic answers. And I think that increasingly we've got to recognize that the second of those is as important. Now, there are plenty of examples where there is one right answer. So that would be one. If you want a framework that I think does this very effectively, it's actually the one that we're just about to use in an intervention study in England, linking our own model with the Australian Council for Educational Research's model. And one of the strands in their assessment rubric is around the quality of ideas. And it isn't just about novelty or even about elaboration, but about fitness for purpose. And I think quite often it's that fitness for purpose that is the answer, Alison, to your questioner's very, very interesting question.
Really interesting. I also think that idea of being really careful about what we are assessing. So it might be that we want to say divergence is what we want to check, and that's what we're seeing. But yeah, that there is something different about it, and that fitness is a really interesting idea. Natalia, I would like to maybe talk to you about your experience in Colombia. We had a question from Gillian talking about to what extent sort of creative thinking and language are linked. So if your language skills are not very good and you can't express yourself well, does that mean your creative thinking assessment doesn't go well? Have you got any data from that in Colombia or thoughts about that?
Well, thanks, Allison. That's an excellent question. Actually, up until now, we haven't studied that question. I've just wrote it down because I think it's a very well posed question. What we do know from at least our national frameworks is that creative thinking is something along the lines that Bill mentioned at the beginning, is a interdisciplinary effort from our like national standard point of view. So we don't have any data on the relationship between, language and creative thinking. I've just wrote that question down to look into the data and see what components within the language assessment that we have are directly related with creative thinking according to our national standards, and try to, sort of have a little bit of more of evidence with regards to that question. Thanks.
Great. Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question. And this is an open question talking about the school cultural climate. Has there been any research or the idea of and this sort of links to what Bo you were talking about, and also Bill what you were talking about, the idea of the valuing of creative thinking within the school climate, or even broader. Does that impact teachers' attitudes? Does that impact student achievement? Do you think there is a link, or can student creativity push through even a climate that might be a little bit negative about creative thinking? Bo, did you want to go first?
I can get a start of it. Absolutely, there's a link, and I think some of the research also by Mark Runco in the early days. If you wanna support creativity, you have to reward it. You have to be open towards new ideas, and you have to be positive towards it. It's like play, open-minded and positive towards the opportunity it provides. It also links to the environment, which there was a question around. It needs some flexibility in the environment. Like in the early years, we have materials and exploration, and then suddenly you get into a sterile school environment. So this idea that you can use a school environment for many different things, many different purposes and so forth. But for teachers, then it requires some systematicity, because the challenge of teachers is you can't just go into any kind of open environment, pull out a lot of materials and get it back on the shelf again. But I think it leans to that bigger challenge, that is, if we're able to use and think about the school as part of an ecosystem that works with the community, like what Bill was mentioning, also authentic problems, then that supports this whole mindset about flexibility and working together. There's so many opportunities if we can use the communities as examples of the projects that children and students work on, and think about it as a partnership where we document these things. So there's a lot around this mindset about what is exactly creativity, how do we structure it, but how do we integrate it with school and outdoor.
Allison, you're on mute.
Yeah, I am. It happens to the best of us. So that's excellent. Someone in the chat has actually just said that, yeah, it really links to leadership and factors enabling creativity as well. So it's not just about teacher professional development, but it's really a full culture or environment change. Bill, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I really like Bo's word ecosystem. I think that's what we're talking about. And of course, everybody in an ecosystem, especially a complex adaptive system, has their roles to play. And sometimes the consequences of what you do are intentional and some of them are not. So, I mean, we know from our research, and we're building on colleagues like Anna Kraft and Ron Bagetto and James Kaufman, a lot of people have written a lot about this, that we need an atmosphere, a culture in which questions are genuinely valued. If I wanted to understand a truly creative school, I'd be an invisible Martian and watch classrooms to see the number of questions that teachers asked that they don't know the answer to. That would be a really strong indicator of a creative school. Playfulness, again, the Lego Foundation's written lovely things about this. I think there's a very close correlation. Risk-taking, mistake-making, Mario was talking about that. I think the broad field covered by people like Carol Dweck and Angela Duckworth and David Perkins around mindset is critical here. And actually, I think the degree to which collaboration and alternative viewpoints are genuinely welcomed. Now, that's many school leaders would say that's what they do, but quite often, I think perhaps we don't. So the answer is a huge yes. It's all about the culture. I mean, I think culture eats everything for lunch at school.
Excellent. All right. We are unfortunately very close to the end of time, so I'm going to have to stop here. There has been many more questions in the chat. Thank you to all of those that have contributed. We really appreciate them. A big thank you to Bill, to Bo, to Natalia, Natalie, and Mario for your insights. I know that this has been lots of work, and putting it in an hour is a bit difficult, but we really appreciate it, and I think that the participants here would agree. And thank you to everybody that's participated for your interest in our work. A quick reminder that a recording of this webinar, as well as the presentation, will be made available on our webinar page soon. And if you'd like to keep up to date with our latest work on education and skills, as well as these results on creative thinking that we'll be releasing sometime in the future, I would invite you to have a look at our Twitter page, which is at OECD Edu Skills. That's where we'll put everything up. So thank you to all of you for joining, and I hope to see everybody at our next webinar. Thanks a lot. Bye.